Arthur Harrison had always been a man of discipline and silent resilience. At 78, his back still bore the straightness of a soldier, even if time had bowed it slightly. On this chilly March morning, he stepped out with the same purposefulness that had carried him through jungles and deserts in decades long gone. But today, his battlefield was a local branch of the bank he'd trusted for over 40 years. His mission, to withdraw enough money to pay for his wife's urgently needed medication, something the VA's delays had made impossible. As he entered the brightly lit lobby, Arthur's presence was largely unnoticed by the younger patrons tapping away on their phones. He walked up to the counter with the aid of a polished wooden cane, worn smooth by years of use, and slid his ID and bank card across to the teller, a young man with a too-tight tie and the detached courtesy of someone trained more in protocol than empathy. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you today?" "I'd like to withdraw $600, Arthur said. "It's for my wife's medication. I'd appreciate it if we could move a little quickly. She's not well." The teller, Kevin, tapped away on his keyboard, brows furrowing slightly. He muttered, more to himself than to Arthur. After a moment, he looked up. "I'm sorry, sir, but it appears your account has been temporarily locked due to a security update. You'll need to call our customer support line to have it reactivated." Arthur blinked. "Temporarily locked? What does that mean?" "There's money in there, I saw the statement just yesterday. My wife needs her medication today." "Yes, I understand," Kevin said, in a tone that made it clear he didn't. "It's part of a routine system-wide update. You'll just need to verify your identity through the central hotline. Unfortunately, there's nothing I can do here at the branch level." Arthur's throat tightened. "Son, I served this country for 30 years. I have a veteran's pension that comes into that account every month like clockwork. I don't have time to sit on hold with an automated voice while my wife's lying in bed barely able to breathe. Please." Kevin shifted uncomfortably but held firm. "I really am sorry, sir. The system won't let me override this." The old soldier felt a knot twist in his chest. Not anger, at least, not yet, but something deeper. Helplessness. Something he hadn't felt since the day they'd zipped up a body bag containing one of his men and told him there was nothing more he could have done. He looked around the lobby, as if someone might step in. No one did. The world, it seemed, moved too fast now for men like him. He reached out and took back his card and ID with slow, deliberate movements. Kevin, perhaps sensing the weight of the moment, offered a hollow consolation. "Here's a flyer with the customer care number. They're pretty responsive, usually." Arthur took the flyer without looking at it. He didn't say anything. Just nodded and stepped away from the counter. But something inside him stirred, a voice he hadn't heard in years. The voice of his younger self, the platoon leader who never accepted a door slammed in his face without knocking harder. The soldier who had once fought to extract a captured comrade against all odds, not because it was protocol, but because it was right. He stepped aside to a quiet corner of the bank and pulled out his phone. The screen was cracked, its case frayed. His fingers trembled slightly, not from age, but from a suppressed fury tempered by decades of restraint. He scrolled slowly through the contacts, then stopped. James Sterling. It had been over 15 years since they last spoke, back when James was a hot-headed communications officer in Arthur's unit. He'd gone corporate, climbed the ranks fast, and the last Arthur heard, he'd become the CEO of one of the largest banking institutions in the country. The same bank Arthur now stood in. A long breath escaped him. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the name. Then he tapped. The phone rang once. Twice. Then a voice answered. Confident. Calm. Familiar. Sterling. Arthur's voice was steady, even if the emotion swelled beneath it. "It's Arthur Harrison. I wouldn't call if it wasn't serious." There was a pause, just long enough for recognition to settle in. "Arthur? Jesus. Is everything all right?" No. I'm at one of your branches. They've frozen my account. My wife's dying, James. She needs her meds now. They're telling me to call customer support. A long silence. Then Sterling's voice dropped an octave. All CEO polish vanished. Which branch? Arthur told him. I'm on my way, Sterling said. Don't leave. Give me 7 minutes. Arthur ended the call and looked up. The fluorescent lights still buzzed. The line at the counter still moved. But something had shifted. He was no longer just an old man with a frozen account. He had called in a promise. And help was on the way. Arthur sat on the plastic bench near the corner window of the bank lobby, the same way he once sat on an ammo crate in the wet heat of Kandahar, calm on the surface, but calculating. The hollow murmur of transactions, digital beeps, and printer chimes echoed around him like distant gunfire. He tightened his grip on the cane resting between his knees. His other hand held his phone loosely, screen dark now, the call with Sterling already receding into the hum of the moment. He let his eyes close for a breath. And the past came back, uninvited. A young man's scream. Smoke pouring from a roadside ambush. Blood. Sand. The scream again, this time with a name, Sterling. And Arthur had thrown himself into the crossfire, dragging the kid out from under a burning transport. No medals for that one. No reporters. Just a broken shoulder that never healed quite right and a kid with a new lease on life. Sterling had promised him something that day. If I ever get out of this, I owe you everything. Anything. Arthur had nodded but never called it in. Until now. The memory passed like a wave, leaving behind only salt. He opened his eyes. A woman at the next table was staring at him. Maybe it was the uniform jacket, neatly folded over his arm. Maybe it was the scars on his hand, or the way his face looked like it had held back tears more times than it had let them fall. Are you okay, sir? She asked gently. He managed a small nod. Just waiting for someone. And then, right on cue, the air shifted. The lobby doors slid open with a hiss, and in walked a man who didn't belong in fluorescent light. James Sterling wore a navy suit that probably cost more than Arthur's truck, but his eyes were the same, piercing, alert, carrying the same flicker of loyalty Arthur remembered from war. Employees froze. One of the managers dropped her tablet. A security guard straightened. Mr. Sterling, the branch manager stammered, rushing forward. We weren't expecting. I'm not here for protocol, Sterling said sharply. He was already moving past her, scanning the lobby until his eyes locked on Arthur's. I'm here for him. Arthur rose, slower than he would have liked, but with the pride of a man who still stood tall when it mattered. Sterling reached him in 2 strides. You should have called sooner, Sterling said, his voice low. Arthur shook his head. Didn't need anything, until now. Sterling turned to the branch manager. Unfreeze his account. Now. And override any blocks. I want him to have unrestricted access to every dollar he's ever earned. But, sir, the compliance system. I am the compliance system. Do it. There was no argument after that. Within minutes, Arthur's card was returned, the screen showed a green status, and the teller was apologizing profusely while counting out 6 crisp hundreds into his hand. But Arthur barely acknowledged the cash. He was already moving. As they exited the bank, Sterling matched Arthur's stride. I'll have a private medical team sent to your house by the hour, he said. And I want your wife's prescriptions covered under my name, no red tape, no insurance delays. I can make that happen. Arthur paused by his truck. That's generous, James. No, Sterling replied. It's just due. Arthur opened the door, setting the envelope of cash on the passenger seat. Then he turned to face the man beside him. I need you to do one more thing. Anything. Tell me how many other veterans have had their accounts frozen like mine. Sterling hesitated. I want the number, James. And then I want to help fix it. Sterling studied him for a long moment, the businessman briefly eclipsed by the soldier he once was. You're not done fighting, he said finally. Arthur slid into the driver's seat. I never was. The truck engine rumbled to life. As he pulled out of the parking lot, the city felt different, smaller somehow. Or maybe Arthur felt larger. Like he had remembered something vital about himself. He wasn't just a man trying to save his wife. He was a man with a mission. And the war had just begun. Arthur had only been home for an hour when the hum of a black Range Rover announced itself outside his weather-worn porch. The vehicle didn't idle long. It stopped, silent and precise, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. A moment later, the door opened and a tall man stepped out, crisp navy overcoat buttoned up despite the spring heat. His gait was unhurried. Intentional. The way a man walks when he owns not just the room, but the building, the block, the future. Arthur watched him through the window while spooning soup into his wife's trembling hands. The broth smelled of ginger and bones and quiet sacrifice. He hadn't told her about the account being unfrozen yet, only that things would be okay now. Outside, the man approached the door and knocked just once. Arthur stood slowly. He wasn't in the habit of welcoming snakes, but this wasn't just any man. This was Charles Valand, CEO of Dominion Financial Holdings, the parent conglomerate of every bank, investment branch, and wealth management arm within 3 states, including the institution that had frozen Arthur's account in the first place. Arthur opened the door without a word. Valand didn't offer his hand. Didn't smile. He looked at Arthur the way a general assesses a battlefield, calculating, clinical, respectful, if only because he recognized another warrior. Mr. Hale, Valand said with a voice so even, it made the air feel measured. May I come in? Arthur stepped aside. You already did. The day your system locked my money while my wife was fighting to breathe. Valand entered the house with silent footfalls, eyes scanning the room not in judgment, but with surprising attentiveness. No pretense. No small talk. He nodded once toward the woman lying on the recliner under a faded quilt. I'm sorry, he said, and Arthur was almost surprised by the softness in his tone. No veteran should have gone through what you did. This wasn't a policy. It was a failure. Arthur raised an eyebrow. A failure of what exactly? Protocol? Or conscience? Valand's jaw clenched. A failure of oversight. An automatic fraud flag went up after you tried to transfer your emergency reserve to the hospital. The algorithm assumed it was a scam. It froze your accounts. But it should have been reviewed by a human. And that's where we failed. Arthur folded his arms. You built the machine, Charles. This isn't just about me anymore. How many others got flagged while trying to live? There was a long silence. Valand pulled something from the inner pocket of his coat and handed it over. A thin tablet, screen unlocked. Arthur's fingers hovered for a moment, then tapped. Rows of names. Dates. Statuses. All red-tagged. All veterans. Dozens of them. Some cases were still unresolved. Arthur's voice went low. They were just trying to pay rent. Buy insulin. Cover school fees. I know, Valand said, and for the first time, the mask cracked just slightly. And that's why I'm here. You're not the only one who believes this needs fixing. Arthur stared hard at him. Then why now? Why me? Because you're the one who didn't break, Valand answered. You still have your mind, your name, and a spine that scares half my board. And because Sterling called me. Arthur's lips twitched. He said you'd be owed money with a god complex. Valand actually smiled. I am. But even gods answer when soldiers come knocking. He took a deep breath, then looked Arthur dead in the eye. I want to build something. A program. A new department, staffed by veterans, for veterans. Real humans reviewing real cases. No AI, no cues, no, please hold. I want you to lead it. Arthur let out a small, disbelieving laugh. You think a clean conscience comes with a title and a salary? No, Valand said. But impact does. Arthur didn't answer right away. He walked over to the sink, rinsed the spoon his wife had just used, and placed it in the drying rack with slow, deliberate care. Then he looked back. You want me to come back to the world that forgot me? No, Valand said. I want you to help remake it. The offer hung in the air, heavy and quiet. Arthur thought of the men and women on that list. He thought of the years he'd spent watching bureaucracy swallow good people whole. And he thought of the fight that had begun when his card was declined at the pharmacy and something deep inside him had decided, no more. Finally, he walked over to Valand and extended his hand. I'll do it, Arthur said. But not for you. For them. Valand nodded. That's the only answer I hoped for. As the Range Rover disappeared into the darkening road, Arthur returned inside. His wife was asleep now, a peaceful breath rising and falling beneath the quilt. He sat beside her, took her hand in his. A storm had passed. But another had begun to form on the horizon. Not one of destruction. But of change. And this time, Arthur Hale would not be fighting alone. Arthur Hale sat behind a desk again, only this time, it wasn't a battlefield of balance sheets or strategic investments. It was a war room of real people, broken policies, and long overdue justice. The office was simple. No leather throne, no skyline view. Just a second-floor corner room inside a brick Veterans Outreach building in downtown Fort Landon. Arthur had declined Dominion's offer to work from headquarters. He said reform couldn't be built from ivory towers. It had to grow where the pain lived. They called the project the Sentinel Division, an internal department of Dominion staffed by former military personnel, social workers, and trauma specialists. Its sole purpose, to review, resolve, and prevent banking lockouts against vulnerable customers, particularly veterans, the elderly, and those flagged by automated systems without human review. Arthur's first act as director was radical: pause the system. Every algorithm-based freeze on any account flagged under suspicious emergency transfers was halted pending manual review. He had to fight tooth and nail with legal and compliance teams. Valand backed him, sometimes publicly, sometimes with silent nods in backrooms, but there was tension in every corner of the building. And then, the stories began to flood in. A widow in Nebraska who couldn't bury her husband because her pension was frozen. A retired Navy cook in Michigan who sold his medals to buy insulin after being denied access to his disability funds. A blind vet in Tampa who spent Christmas under a bridge because the system flagged his hotel bill as fraud. Each case hit like a bullet to the chest. But they weren't just sob stories, they were proof of rot. Arthur didn't flinch. He met every client. Shook every hand. And made damn sure every correction came with an apology, compensation, and a personal letter signed by him. But reform has enemies. Some called him reckless. Dominion stock dropped 3 points in the first quarter of the reforms. Investors grumbled about overreach, about pandering to optics, and emotional governance. One news outlet called him the empath in combat boots, mocking his war vet justice crusade. But for every critic, 10 more voices rose behind him. Former employees asked to return. Regulators took notice, but not with threats. With curiosity. Arthur found himself testifying before subcommittees, being invited to roundtables, even interviewed on national television. People didn't just see a man trying to fix a broken system, they saw a man fighting it. And still, he stayed grounded. He returned home every evening to his wife, whose health had begun to stabilize. The medication finally arrived, the treatments finally consistent. He'd sit beside her and read aloud from her favorite books, her fingers curling around his like they had in the hospital bed that day, when the world had nearly buried them under a single automated decision. But one night, she turned to him and asked, "Arthur, what happens when you fix it? When the system is healed?" He didn't answer right away. Because deep down, he knew, this wasn't a wound you could stitch shut. It was a living organism. A constantly shifting machine that had to be watched, guided, and sometimes fought from within. But reform was no longer just an ideal. It had become an architecture. Arthur began drafting what he called the Human First Mandate, a binding internal policy that required every algorithmic decision affecting account access to be reviewed within 4 hours by a human team, with priority given to accounts tagged as critical need. He also embedded mandatory trauma-informed training for all staff dealing with at-risk clients. It wasn't sexy. It wasn't headline-worthy. But it worked. 3 months in, the division had cleared over 2,000 cases. Dominion's public trust score climbed. Other banks quietly reached out to copy the framework. For the first time in a long time, Arthur saw something he hadn't seen since deployment. Hope. Not the false, polished kind served in boardrooms, but the gritty, gravel-and-sweat kind that grows when people earn their second chances. Still, not all battles are external. Arthur found himself waking at 3 a.m., sometimes to silence, sometimes to echoes, voices from the field, from the hospital, from the day the pharmacy refused his card. The trauma hadn't vanished. It had simply evolved. The mission had grown beyond survival. It was about legacy now. One evening, after returning from a town hall in Tulsa, he found a letter on his desk. Handwritten. No return address. Inside, a single line. "You don't know me, but because of you, my daughter got her medicine in time. Thank you, Mr. Hale. Thank you for standing when the rest of us couldn't." He sat down, letter in hand, and finally allowed himself to breathe. To feel. Arthur Hale had crossed the threshold, faced the ordeal, seized the sword, and brought back the elixir, not of wealth or vengeance, but of reform. The world hadn't changed completely. But it had begun. And sometimes, that beginning is enough to change everything. Arthur Hale stood at the edge of a familiar field, an old, open space just outside Fort Landon, where his father once taught him how to throw a curveball. The grass was longer now, the fence more rust than iron. But the wind still carried that same bittersweet scent of dust, pine, and memory. It had been over a year since he'd taken the first call. Since the moment the system told him his life, and his wife's, wasn't valid enough to process a payment. A year since everything broke. And then started to mend. The Sentinel Division had become more than a program, it had become a movement. A model copied by other institutions. A framework quietly adopted by banks too proud to say they were wrong, but humble enough to learn. Arthur had grown the department from 12 to over 200 analysts, many of them veterans, caretakers, or survivors of the very systems they now reviewed. They didn't wear suits. They wore flannel, worn boots, and the calm fire of people who had known crisis firsthand. But not everything had healed so neatly. Inside Dominion, a resistance had been building, not from the bottom, but from the boardroom. Quietly, insidiously, a block of executives had begun to see Arthur as more than a reformer. He had become a threat, to the old way, to profit margins that favored automation over accountability. They began to cut around the edges. Slow funding draws. Strategic delays. Even rumors that the entire Sentinel model was a temporary PR solution. Arthur fought. Not with shouts or threats, but with evidence. With stories. With data that showed fewer frozen accounts, higher retention among clients, a rise in institutional trust. But progress, he learned, rarely wins against convenience. And so, one morning, without warning, he received a letter on official Dominion letterhead. Clinical. Cold. Final. As part of an internal restructuring process, the Sentinel division will be phased into a broader customer service overhaul. Your services, while appreciated, are no longer required. No meeting. No explanation. No ceremony. It was over. At least, that's what they thought. Arthur didn't rage. He didn't rally the media or storm the gates. Instead, he spent a week in silence. Walking. Thinking. Watching the way the spring crept into the trees. Listening to his wife's breath in the quiet of the early mornings. And then he packed a bag. He didn't go far, just enough. Across counties. Across towns. Across pain. For 3 months, he traveled the state, sometimes sleeping in the bed of his truck, sometimes on couches offered by strangers who somehow recognized him. Veterans, single moms, retirees, people who told him their stories. People who showed him the fractures still bleeding at the base of the system. He recorded everything. Not with cameras. With a notebook. By the end of summer, he had more than pages. He had a manifesto. When autumn hit, Arthur returned, not to Dominion, but to the world. He launched a public initiative called Stand Human, an independent watchdog coalition aimed at protecting the rights of everyday citizens against cold automation, policy loopholes, and unaccountable power. No investors. No shareholders. Just volunteers, truth, and grit. He released a book titled The Freeze Point: How Systems Forget People, and How We Remember Them. It was raw. Honest. Sometimes ugly. But it resonated. Within weeks, it climbed bestseller lists. Within months, it was being quoted in Congress. Then one day, sitting on his porch beside his wife, he received a letter, this time handwritten. It was from Charles Valand. Arthur. You were right. We failed again. I lost the vote. They buried your work. But they can't bury the fire you lit. I left the company last week. I'm joining your fight. If you'll have me. Arthur didn't reply immediately. Instead, he folded the letter, placed it under his wife's tea mug to keep it from blowing away, and walked back into the house. There was more to build. And this time, he didn't need permission. Years later, schoolchildren would learn his name not from bank commercials, but from civic textbooks. From grassroots documentaries. From testimonials whispered in shelters and hospitals, in kitchens and nursing homes. Because Arthur Hale had not just survived a system. He had rewritten its purpose. Not as a warrior of vengeance. But as a sentinel of dignity. The message was never about one man. It was about the truth we forget in our pursuit of efficiency. Systems are only as human as the hearts behind them. And sometimes, it takes being broken to remember that the real power is choosing to care anyway.